The founder died. The brand didn't know how to bury him. This is brand damage. The first sign that something was deeply off was that the grief itself had already become content. And I do not mean that in some cold, inhuman, anti emotion way. I mean that once something intimate is filmed, framed, shot from multiple angles, and then posted publicly, it is no longer just grief. It is communications, it is optics, it is narrative, it is brand behavior. And in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, that distinction mattered immediately because the public was not first given a calm, disciplined institutional sense of what came next. The public was given Erika Kirk draped over Charlie's body in the casket, filmed close, posted to Instagram, and served up to millions of people who had never asked to be invited into that moment. And I think for a lot of people on a gut level, the reaction was not even fully ideological. It was more primal than that. It was, why are we seeing this? And second, someone had to film this. Someone had to move in for the shot. Someone had to choose the angle. Someone had to decide this should be public. That was the first crack. And this episode is about the cracks. Not about proving every rumor on the internet, not about saying widows are not allowed to grieve. Widows and anybody else who's grieving are absolutely going to do things that might seem odd to the rest of us in that grief. I've been there. I'm sure you've been there. That's not the point of this. It's not about pretending people do not behave strangely in shock. It is about what happens when a founder dependent political brand loses its founder, and instead of managing that transition with discipline, legitimacy, and transparency, it starts doing something much stranger. Because Charlie Kirk's death did not just create a hole in Turning Point, it exposed how much of the brand's coherence depended on Charlie himself. And once he was gone, the organization almost immediately started feeling less like a stable institution and more like a haunted stage set where everyone was trying to keep the founder present long after he was no longer there to hold the thing together. Before all of this, Erika Kirk was not broadly understood as a major operator inside this machine. She was known mostly as Charlie's wife, former Miss Arizona, stay at home wife and mother according to both her own public framing and his. And to be clear, I am not knocking that at all. I am also a wife and mother. I am not saying that being a wife or being feminine or being domestic somehow makes a woman incapable of doing serious things. That is not the issue. The issue is legitimacy. When a founder of a major political organization dies suddenly and violently, the first thing people look for is succession logic. They want to know who runs this now, why, what qualifies them, what was the plan, was there a plan? And what made this so strange so quickly was that there did not appear to be a visible answer to any of that beyond his wife. There are very few serious businesses or institutions where that by itself is enough. If your husband builds a multi-million dollar media and political machine and then dies in a traumatic public assassination, the average person does not assume the next obvious step is that his widow becomes CEO days later, especially if she was not already visibly functioning as an executive leader in that organization. That is not misogyny, it's just a normal question. Inheriting grief is not the same thing as inheriting executive authority. And because the transition already felt weird, every single thing after that started landing harder. The casket post was not just uncomfortable because it was intimate, it was uncomfortable because it felt like the first indication that private grief was going to be folded directly into public branding. And once that happens, the audience starts losing its footing. Because what are they supposed to do with that? Are they witnessing a sacred private moment? Are they consuming content? Are they being asked to sympathize? Are they being asked to defer? Are they being managed emotionally? The answer increasingly felt like all of the above. And then very quickly, another sign appeared that this was not just an awkward grieving process playing out in public. The leak started. And that matters a lot because once internal material starts leaking this early, things like recordings, meetings, emails, stories about firings, stories about staff being pushed out, stories about people working brutal hours only to be treated like disposable liabilities. You are no longer looking at the internet being mean to Erika Kirk. You are looking at an institution starting to come apart from the inside, and that's a very different problem. Leaks like this do not usually happen in healthy organizations where the people closest to the machine still trust the people running it. They happen when insiders decide that whatever is happening behind closed doors is bad enough, dishonest enough, or unstable enough that it's worth the risk to let the public see it. That is huge. When insiders start torching the integrity narrative in real time, the problem is no longer just optics. It suggests the institution itself is unstable. So, no sooner had Erica taken over than the leaks began, which is usually a sign that people closest to the machine no longer trust the people running it. And what those leaks suggested was not just ordinary growing pains after a tragedy. They suggested employee disillusionment, retaliatory firings, organizational paranoia, internal distrust, and a leadership environment already brittle enough that the people were either being thrown out, silenced, or deciding on their own that loyalty was no longer worth the price. That's not what stability looks like. It is, however, what a legitimacy crisis looks like in its larval stage. Because once people inside the building start leaking recordings and emails and internal chaos, the audience outside the building stops thinking, maybe this is just a rough patch. They start thinking, how bad is it over there if even the insiders are willing to burn the place down on the way out? And that is the moment when the story shifts from bad optics to institutional rot. Then came the memorial, or rather, the thing that often felt more like a MAGA rally than a memorial. A massive arena, stagecraft, speeches, spectacle, pyrotechnics. A kind of movement energy that may have made sense if you were trying to galvanize a base, but felt deeply strange if you were allegedly burying a man who had just been graphically assassinated in front of the whole world. That was a major turning point. Once the event starts looking more like mobilization than mourning, people get uneasy. And I don't just mean people who hated Charlie. I mean supporters too. People who were inclined to be sympathetic, people who wanted to assume good faith, people who would normally have every incentive to defend the organization. Even they started feeling that something was off. And no, the outfits were not the main story. A lot of people got very online and petty about fashion, and I am not especially interested in spending 25 minutes pretending that leather pants at a memorial are by themselves the downfall of Western civilization. They are not. But what clothing can do, and what it often does in situations like this, is amplify a larger discomfort that is already present. When the tone already feels wrong, the styling starts to feel like evidence. When the event already feels overproduced, the visual choices stop reading as neutral. And that is what happened here. The problem was never just she wore something weird. The problem was that the entire thing began to feel like the brand had no idea how to distinguish between grief, legacy, movement theater, and personal image management. And then layered over all of this came one of the most important rhetorical patterns in the whole story. It's what Charlie would have wanted. You heard it everywhere. He would have wanted this. He would have wanted her to lead. He would have wanted the work to continue this way. He would have wanted this event. He would have wanted this tone. He would have wanted this posture. And maybe some of that is true. Maybe some of it isn't. That's not even the point. The point is that once the dead founder becomes the justification for every controversial, present day decision, something very unhealthy starts happening because ghosts are incredibly easy to control. The dead cannot correct you, they cannot publicly contradict you. They cannot say, actually, no, I did not want that at all. They cannot distinguish between what they believed, what they said in public, what they said in private, and what the surviving leadership now finds convenient to claim on their behalf. The dead founder becomes a ventriloquist dummy. And that is exactly what started to feel so creepy here. Charlie Kirk became not just the absent founder, but the rhetorical puppet through which every current decision could be laundered, and the audience could feel it. That discomfort intensified even more when Erika and others around the brand started telling people not to ask questions. And strategically, this was one of the dumbest moves imaginable. This was a completely unforced error because this is not a normal corporate audience conditioned to trust institutions, accept official narratives, and quietly wait for approved information. This is an audience that has been marinated for years in institutional distrust. A movement ecosystem where skepticism is a virtue, where asking questions is a virtue, where digging deeper is a virtue, where not accepting the official story is not some fringe behavior, but often the basic emotional operating system of the audience. Charlie himself built a lot of his appeal inside that world. So when the response to public discomfort and suspicion becomes essentially, stop, don't ask, how dare you, just believe us, you are not merely being emotionally clumsy. You are violating the very instincts that helped build the audience in the first place. You cannot build a movement on suspicion of official narratives and then demand reverent silence when the questions become inconvenient. That is not how this works. And to be fair, people did try to give her grace. Okay? And that part matters. All right. In the aftermath, there was a lot of emotional deference, shock, sympathy, donations, people telling themselves everyone grieves differently, people suppressing their instincts a bit because the thing that had happened was so brutal and public and destabilizing. She had a grace period, a real one. And that makes what happened next even more significant because the backlash did not come from nowhere. It came after a lot of people had already tried to give the situation the benefit of the doubt. Amfest happened. And this is where, in my view, the whole thing really blew open because up to that point, a lot of what people were feeling could still be described as discomfort, unease, something is off energy. Amfest is where it started to look grotesque. The tent, or recreation of it, becoming a kind of photo booth or symbolic installation where people are taking selfies, like under the actual booth that Charlie died under, or a recreation of the actual booth he died under. The invitation list, including people Charlie had publicly clashed with or criticized. The event tone drifting further from memorial, from respectful, from remembrance, into something like spectacle. Everybody on the internet was talking about how this looked like WWE, again with the pyrotechnics. The now infamous Nicki Minaj assassin remark, which was apparently meant as slang praise and instead landed like someone stomping around in a nightmare. Erika once again stepping into the center of the whole thing with styling and staging that felt less like solemn transition and more like a woman heading up to a brand relaunch through martyr haze. At some point, the memorial aesthetics gave way to something much stranger, martyr-themed event production. And the audience was not wrong to feel disturbed by that. This was no longer just a widow grieving differently. This was now a CEO presiding over the symbolic use of her dead husband inside a major political brand. That changes the rules. It just does. And then there's the competence question. TPUSA is a 501c3. So when Erika stands on a TPUSA stage at TPUSA's flagship event and says plainly, "We are going to get JD Vance elected," that raises a very basic issue. Does she not know the rules of the organization she's running, or does she think the rules don't apply to her? At a minimum, it suggests she either doesn't understand the compliance rules of her own organization or is reckless enough to ignore them in public. So at a certain point, this stopped being speculation and became an actual institutional fracture. One of TPUSA's largest university chapters at the University of Arkansas announced it was dissolving its affiliation with the national organization and rebranding under its own label, Young American Revival. And what matters is not just that they left, it's why they left. This is not random internet gossip. This is not Candace Owens stirring the pot. This is not some troll account farming engagement. This is people inside the broader ecosystem telling you very plainly that they no longer trust what the national brand has become. And this wasn't just some random student leader with no real connection to Charlie or the deeper life of the organization. The chapter president had been running that Arkansas chapter for years. It was one of the biggest TPUSA chapters in the country. He had interacted directly with Charlie, had appeared in recorded discussions with him, and had even appeared on the show after the assassination. So when someone like that says the rhetoric around what Charlie would have wanted feels manipulative, that lands very differently than if it were coming from somebody on the outside looking in. And the decision, importantly, was unanimous, which matters. It matters because this wasn't one emotional college kid going rogue. It wasn't some chapter getting swept up in internet drama. It wasn't a bunch of latecomers following a trend. This was an executive board making a deliberate decision that they no longer wanted to remain attached to the national brand. They wrote, and I'm going to quote here, "Though for some time now it has seemed that this organization has lost sight of what is truly important. We are no longer focused on our guiding North Star, that is, fighting for conservative policy principles and values. At least that is how I have always understood it. Instead, it feels that we have become consumed with metrics, creating the next viral cultural moment and generally chasing relevance. We have become reactionary when we needed to be proactive." So that alone is an indictment. They are basically accusing the organization of abandoning its stated mission in favor of metrics, virality, and relevance chasing. But then it gets worse. They go on to say, "We have many grievances with Turning Point USA, which we will shortly make known to them in private, but I will share only one. We are generally put off by how Charlie Kirk has been used by TPUSA since his assassination. Statements like Charlie would have said and Charlie would have wanted have felt in many instances disingenuous and manipulative. Charlie cannot speak for himself anymore, and we do not recognize the way others have attempted to speak for him." That is devastating because that is not the left saying it. That is not some anonymous critic saying it. That is not some internet ghoul saying it. That's not even Candace Owens saying it. That is one of your own biggest chapters led by someone who actually knew Charlie in the context that matters here, saying, "We do not recognize what you were doing with this man's legacy." And once you reach the point where people inside your own ecosystem are publicly saying that your use of the dead founder feels disingenuous and manipulative, you no longer have a messaging problem. You have a legitimacy problem. At that point, the issue is not bad optics. The issue is that your own people are starting to think the whole thing is spiritually fraudulent. And once one of your biggest chapters decides the only way forward is to cut ties and build something new, the problem is no longer whether the brand looks unstable. The problem is that the brand has started to lose the consent of the people who are supposed to help carry it forward. The problem is legitimacy. And from there, the deeper fracture began to show. The rewriting of Charlie himself. This is where I think the public trust problem becomes impossible to ignore. Charlie had publicly documented views. He said things on his own show, on other people's shows. in interviews, in texts, in conversations. He was a public figure whose brand was built in large part on taking positions, arguing them, defending them, changing them sometimes, and making those shifts visible. That was the whole thing. So, when after his death, the organization starts acting as though inconvenient late stage shifts in his thinking either did not happen, did not matter, or should be quietly smoothed over in the service of present strategy, the audience notices. And once they notice that, the weirdness compounds. Because now it's not just why is the widow suddenly CEO? Why was the grief turned into content? Why did the memorial feel like a rally? Why are we being told not to ask questions? Now it becomes, why are you also trying to rewrite the founder while still using him as your moral authority? It's catastrophic brand behavior. It makes the audience feel like they're watching a ghost get puppeteered. And yes, it is deeply strange to keep Charlie's show alive without Charlie in a way that still tries to preserve the seat, the structure, the ritual, the aura, as though he might somehow still be directing things from the beyond. When Rush Limbaugh died, they did not keep doing the Rush Limbaugh show as though Rush were just briefly unavailable, because you kind of need Rush for that to be the Rush Limbaugh show. That same eerie feeling applies here. So at a certain point, refusing to let the founder actually be gone stops reading as tribute and starts reading as control. That's where I think a lot of the current heat around Erika really comes from. Not because everyone has the same theory, not because everyone believes one particular rumor or another, not because every critic is a Candace Owens acolyte or a heartless ghoul tormenting a widow, but because people can feel quite clearly that this transition has not been normal, not been transparent, and not been managed in a way that inspires trust. Here is the crucial point. The moment Erika became more than Charlie's widow, the moment she became the brand, the public stopped being obligated to treat her only as a mourner. It's not cruelty, that's just reality. If you are the CEO of a multi-million-dollar political organization with major influence, you do not get to remain permanently above scrutiny because your husband died tragically. The tragedy can buy sympathy. It cannot buy indefinite immunity from questions. And when the response to scrutiny is to send out surrogates to call everyone demons, shame the audience, and insist that people are being cruel to a grieving widow, that only makes it worse because nobody is buying that frame anymore. Or at least not enough people are buying it to stabilize the brand. You can see it in the comments. You can see it in the way even adjacent audiences are reacting now. Not with horror at the critics, but with exhaustion at the obvious spin. People want transparency. They want normal institutional behavior. They want leadership transitions that make sense. They want the founder's death treated like a death, not an endlessly exploitable moral credential. And they're not getting that. So, what is the actual lesson here? It's not just that TPUSA had a messy few months after a founder assassination. It is that the organization revealed something structural about itself. A healthy institution survives the founder by becoming bigger than him. It does not need to keep using his image, his grief, his empty seat, his supposed wishes, and his symbolic remains as the glue holding the thing together. If you have to keep directing the ghost of the founder to legitimize the present, then you have not actually built a stable post-founder institution. You have built a haunted franchise. And that is what this now looks like. The problem was never just grief. It was what happened when grief became governance. I'm Krystina Repucci, and this is Brand Damage. Until next time.